My name is Aron Aji. I'm the university representative to the Board of Directors of UNESCO City of Literature programs. And I'd like to welcome you to the 2025 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by our pride and joy, Iowa City, UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank the sponsors and partners that made this event possible: the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa City Public Library, the Coralville Public Library, Prairie Lights Bookstore, Iowa Public Radio, Think Iowa City, Greater Iowa City, Inc., and the West Bank Corporation Foundation. Support is also provided by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Iowa Arts Council, which exists within the Iowa Economic Development Authority. I really don't know why we have to say that, but I'm following script. Between events, be sure to visit the book fair at Merge, which is right out there, right next door to the public library on the Ped Mall. Iowa City Book Festival events are open to everyone and available at no cost, but they do rely on your support. Please consider donating to the City of Literature by visiting iowacitybookfestival.org and clicking support. Today we welcome author and editor Christina Ward. Christina Ward is an author, editor, and seeker. She's also the president and editor of Feral House, a publisher noted for their books on autre topics. She had the distinct pleasure of riding around town in the Wienermobile with Padma Lakshmi on the hottest day in July 2019 for the Taste the Nation. Her current book, Holy Food: How Cults, Communes, and Religious Movements Influenced What We Eat in American History, is in fact the focus of her presentation. It's a pleasure to have her with us, and let's give a warm welcome to Christina Ward.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I know there's so much going on today, so I really appreciate you deciding to kind of hear my spiel, what I have to say about cults, communes, new religious movements, and food. I wrote the book because I love food. Food's important to us. And I became fascinated at a very early age about that connection of what people believe and how that influenced what they ate. And it set me down the rabbit hole of investigating. And so instead of boring people at bars, telling them about, wait a second, did you know? I wrote a book about it. And so, which is what you have. The book itself has both history and recipes, because as I was telling someone earlier, I believe that, especially when you're talking about history, it's more than just the big names, and it's more than just the facts and figures. So when you see a recipe, when you can eat the food people were eating, sometimes it makes a little more sense. It kind of cements these ideas. So the first thing is, I'm going to do a couple, just what I'm going to talk about. I love when I go to different cities to talk about their cults and communes and things, because every state has them, and they may not be aware of them. So I get to tailor it and talk about the cults in Iowa, which I'm going to do today. So, and communes. I have to, so, and we use the terms kind of back and forth a little bit, but there are official designations, so we should get that out of the way. What is a cult? So a cult is a high control group. And so what that means is if a group or one person is controlling your behavior, the information, meaning the information coming in, what you can tell people, they're controlling your thoughts and what you can think and what you can feel. So a group that is hitting all of those four is considered a cult, a high control group. There are then, kind of a spectrum. There can be low control groups. I mean, your bowling league could be considered kind of cultish. You all wear the same uniform. You all are, show up at the same time. You have a shared goal. So again, these definitions could be very broad. Let me say I'm coming at this with no dog in the fight as to a religion or any other. To me, it's so interesting and observational about just how people develop practices and over time. So if someone is a very true believer, strong believer in something, please know that anything I say is about the practice and not about the belief. So with that being said, let's dig in and start at the beginning, because that's what we have to do to understand. So it won't be a full, history of religion, but there's a few facts we need to know before it makes more sense. And some of the earliest food rules were, thousands of years ago, and we see the image is unclean food, clean food, haram, and so rooted in the kosher food rules and the kashrut in the very early old, what Christians would call the Old Testament and the books of the early books of Numbers. You've got all of these rules. Now, if you were a food scientist and you followed the food rules, you would be very healthy, because a lot of the food rules were about food safety. People think about not eating pork, and why don't we eat pork? Pork is filthy. It's not filthy in the way we're thinking about rolling around the mud. It tends to host a lot of parasites and pathogens, and so if you're cooking over, a wood stove, a wood fire, it would be hard to kind of regulate some of that. So God says, don't eat that. And so that is the kind of genesis, if you will, of all of the food rules that come to America in a modern sense, because then we mix it up as we are the great melting pot. We do that with our food. We do that with our religion. And so that is the one element. So we have to think about, okay, the kosher and haram food rules. And then, of course, from the East and the Indian and Hindu traditions, again, Hindu not being really, but we'll call it, that's an English word, in the Hindu tradition called prasadam, which of course it means holy food. And it's these notions that if you prepare food with holy intent and you follow some of the just cleanliness rules, and then God blesses your food for you. One of the gods will bless your food, and it makes it holy. Now, that sounds very, very reverent, but know that every culture is also irreverent, because, that's an actual ad. So we see that's Bhaprabhata on the bottom, not the Krishna, of the Hare Krishnas. And the Hare Krishna is very influential in American food and essentially introducing kind of Indian foods to the United States. The other thing we need to keep in mind when we talk about feasting and fasting, every religious tradition has a notion of feasting to celebrate God's benefits and God's gifts to people. We also have a tradition, every religious tradition has a tradition of fasting to atone for sins. If we, are bad in God's eyes, we need to give something up. We offer up our suffering. Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving, was a religious feast to thank God for the food. There are still groups today in St. Louis, especially one of the Kagik, that's Church of God in Christ churches, one of the apostolic churches. They do regular fasting as for peace. And they will say, we're going to focus on reducing gun violence in St. Louis, and they'll fast for 4 days. And so these traditions are alive today. The other element to keep in mind, and that is a very silly illustration of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was the great Swedish science philosopher in those days when science and philosophy were essentially the same thing. Was he right about electrons? He was. He also thought that those electrons help us talk to God, and was really one of the early progenitors of what became the spiritualist movements. And so we have talking to God, the food rules from both Muslim traditions and Jewish traditions, the traditions of feasting and fasting. Okay, so those are the things that everyone brings to the United States. And when we get to the United States pretty early on, the other element, of course, is our First Amendment. And that idea that we cannot prohibit or prescribe any religiosity, any religious belief at all, helps people decide and become and grow in a different spiritual pathway. If you think about in Europe, there's still Church of England. religious organizations are regulated. Scientology is illegal in Germany. Jehovah's Witnesses are illegal in Russia and other places. So the United States becomes now this mix of, we've got all these different food kind of traditions and rules, comes to the United States, and there is no government telling you what to do about how you believe. And so that really came to light in the earliest immigrants. Of course, when we think about the Pilgrims, they were religious exiles. They were Calvinist, super fundamentalist Protestants that were at odds with the Church of England. They kind of went over to Amsterdam, which was considered a more freer place. And then finally, you know, even the Dutch got sick of them and said, get on the boat. And that was a way, a lot of those people who were early immigrants to the United States were religious exiles. These are two nice German couples, because if we think about that Protestant Reformation, it wasn't just Luther nailing something on a door. There were hundreds of other little prophets and folks who talked to God and started their own beliefs, because the idea of that was you didn't need an intermediary, and which was a very different notion than what Catholic Europe believed. So we've got that. So now everybody's coming to America, and they came to Amana. So the Germans, and that was from central Germany, kind of central, north of the forest area. That was a large group of very righteous Protestants who believe that. And so Amana, has anybody been to Amana? Because now it's like a National Historic Site, yeah. And so Amana started as this religious exile group. They were arrested, they were thrown in prison, and they decide to come to America. And their leader was appointed by God, got a vision, got a voice, and that leader then kind of determined the outcomes and determined what the groups were going to do. And so these are two nice ladies from Amana. That is an illustration of the cookbooks. One of the things that the folks and they were the inspirationalists, the true inspirationalists, and it's a very long name that I'm not going to remember at this moment, but it's in the book. They brought their German food with them, so they didn't change the food as much but they were able to institute their practices, and they lived as a commune early on. And that commune meant no real shared family spaces, and it meant shared cooking. And so that is an illustration of the cookbooks, the central kitchen. And here's a few more pictures. That's one of the earliest pictures I found of Amana, and that's from the late 1880s. And the two tombstones are from the local graveyard. That's Christian Metz, who was one of the leaders who decided, and very different than many religious groups of that time period, the leadership passed to a woman, to Barbara Landman. And she was actually much more conservative, and that would happen in Amana. Is depending on who was in charge, they would make, you know, the revelations from God. And she was a pretty hard-nosed person, and so she banned any celebrations of Christmas and candy and books and all that stuff. It was fairly austere. But there's pictures of, again, other Amana colony residents doing the work of food. They're very critical in American food development, especially in this area, for one reason. See, there's Amana today. They're still serving the kind of German food, is the refrigeration division, Amana food freezer, and then the woolen mills. But more to our discussion is the Amana colony, the folks in the Amana were the ones who really nailed it on getting refrigeration right. I mean, prior to that, it was like ice boxes, and you know, if you were poor, you just had nothing, and you did food preservation the best you could. So the real revolution and for food with Amana is that really, we'll call it invention of refrigeration. Amana was very different than most cults and communes and new religious movements in the sense that they chose to dissolve themselves. Most groups follow, and this is kind of an important kind of notion about what the difference between what's a new religious movement, what's a cult, is there can be a really illogical concept that somebody's believing, and then they take it to its logical conclusion or extreme. And oftentimes that is a bad result. But sometimes it becomes milder. And so you see that kind of branch off, usually post the founder. It usually becomes much milder or very extreme. Amana voted to dissolve themselves. They became a non-stock corporation, and they equally shared out stock to all of the people living in Amana, those families, and those are very wealthy people to this day, unless they squandered it, but you know. But it was an example of an actually very successful group. After the Germans came, and those were mostly the pietists, and we think about Amish, Mennonite, Hutterites, the inspirationalists, they're all of the same belief system. But then the English came in and brought something else and new, and you could see this kind of crazy kind of timeline / family tree. Okay, stay with me. There is a belief that there are lost tribes of Israel. Of the 12 tribes, there's a lost tribe. Starting in the 1600s, some very, very white British people decided that they were the true Jews. The other Jews, not so much. It's them. And so therefore, they are the inheritor of God's kingdom. And so there were some really convoluted thought processes to get there, and this is an example of one. The notion of like British Israelites or Anglo-Israelites is a really critical, like weird thread that we need to follow, because what happens is it was really popular. It started in the 1600s and then kind of got revived in the 1800s, where people legitimately were believing this. I mean, 5 million people in the United States were members of the group. And so this was like a legitimate belief, because it informs, if we go back to our little history of like central western New York, the Great Awakening, the burned over area. And it was a time, now we've got a lot of immigrants, we've got a lot of people coming over. The United States has been a country almost officially 100 years. White people have been here a couple hundred years. In central New York, there's a preacher that comes through named James Finney, and he just kind of lights everybody on fire with the spirit of the Holy Ghost. And so the people you see there, the three sisters are the Fox sisters, the famous knocking of the spiritualists. The man afraid of the light is Joseph Smith. William Miller is that very dour fellow in the corner, and you would be too. Here's a tip if you're going to start your own kind of cult. Don't give a date for the end of the world. It doesn't work out. And Miller did that, and that is, with the other image you see, that crazy, is his calculations from the Bible to show when the end of the world was happening, and it was going to be 1844. And so you've got all these people in central New York just losing their minds. God is talking to everyone, and you know, and people aren't quite sure what's saying. So after the end of the world didn't come in 1844, Joseph Smith picks up the mantle a bit, and Joseph Smith, of course, being the founder of the Latter-day Saints of Mormonism. One of the tenets of their belief, lost tribe of Judaism. William Miller goes on to kind of the sad trombone music, but people a few years later pick up his mission and his idea of this kind of very reformed, almost baptism as a practice, and revive it as the Seventh-day Adventists, and become very, very focused on food with a very notion, again, taken from the Bible. And a lot of times people would do that. They would take one line from a piece of scripture and base a whole belief system on it, or a whole food system on it. For the SDA is the notion of your body is a temple and it belongs to God is very important, because that became the mission, that it is not just you want to be healthy, you must be healthy. You must take care of your carcass because God needs you to take care of it. They became vegetarians. They eschewed any kind of coffee stimulants, and which is, again, the Mormons did that. So the other notion here to get is all of these people knew each other and interacted with each other in the 1840s. And then what happens with a giant group of people, Amana was its own town, Bishop's Hill across the river in northern Illinois, is, in American political system, it's a representational democracy. So anytime you had a group like Joseph Smith started in New York with the Latter-day Saints as a commune, and they had a voting bloc that could change all the laws of that town, and then they got run out on a rail. And if anybody thinks about like Mormon history a little bit, it's just that Western trail because they're escaping these essentially townies who just don't want those folks there. That happened with a number of the groups. And so as we move on, you can see almost the trajectory as it starts in New York. I don't know if you can kind of tell where New York is. And now we've got even more. And it's not just religion. Now we've got communes. The Fourierists from France, which was a socialist idea of, which I think is one of the most lovely. I'll go down one tangent for you. Charles Fourier, the kind of philosopher who conceptualized these, had a description of what war should be. And he said all warring parties, it should be a dinner party, that the warring sides cook their favorite foods, and then the peoples then vote and decide which cuisine was best, and then you won the war. I still think that is a very good idea that everyone should do. But back to the map, you can see that the burnt over area, the Great Awakening, people are on the move now. They are afire with the Holy Spirit, and they are going to evangelize to the West and try to start these new towns and new communes and place where they can make their own laws and determine what kind of theocracy they can build. And again, it was everywhere. And again, Southern Iowa. And the Harbinger was a great social political process. That was the newsletter of the Fourierites. You notice the date, that's 1846. So I just, a little, people have been socialists a really long time. It's not a new invention. People have always been trying to figure out, how do we live together? How can we be better humans? And a lot of that then does come with the food. And then the United States, there's one more element that brings us to like the explosion of new religious movements, which is the tax code. Only in America, kids. So it used to be, in the early days of the United States, there were no social safety nets. Your social safety net was whatever the church was doing. And so church food pantries, churches were orphanages. They took care of the elderly. They took care of the sick. And it was that community. The Shakers, famously, who again were anti-sex, they were completely celibate, and how did they replenish their members? They took in families, they took in the orphans in the community, and they took in the abused women, and that is how they kept going for, I think there's 2 Shakers left alive at Sabbath Day Lake in Maine, only 2. But as it grows, and these notions, we talk about the tax code, because there was a shift by the late 1890s, and then it really starts to get codified in the early 1900s, this notion of a nonprofit entity. So if we're going to pay income taxes, if business have to pay income taxes, there has to be an offset. Churches do good work, therefore they do not have to pay taxes. If they run a business, they don't have to really pay taxes. There's some convoluted stuff. There's also, I like to show the advantages and disadvantages because it does make a statement as to where we are now, as what any religious nonprofit must remain apolitical. This is according to the letter of the law. Must disclose all financial information. You cannot advocate for policy changes. You have to note all your administrative costs, and lack of connection due to being a nonprofit. That hasn't hurt anybody. So now we've got interesting religious movements that have been exiled from Europe and other places in the United States. We've got the First Amendment, and now we have the tax law. And now it goes crazy with people moving west. So I'm going to go to Los Angeles for a minute because I'm coming back to Iowa. Charles Parham, originally from Kansas. William Seymour, originally from, he was from Virginia. And these 2 men were the founders of the apostolic movement, which is Assemblies of God, if you're familiar with that at all. That is, again, the first ideas of speaking in tongues, God speaking directly to you, the miracle of like the Shakers did, of kind of uncontrollable body movements. And so that started at the Azusa Revival in Los Angeles in the early 1900s. It was bonkers. Thousands and thousands of people were coming to be saved by the Holy Spirit. Other preachers from these newer traditions were coming to Azusa to say, what are they doing right? Because they've got full houses. And so that is how this new fundamentalism and apostolic faith really started taking off. And it came back to Iowa hard. And so by the early 1900s, it was a very fundamentalist Protestant. And in that great circle, because the religion came to Iowa, then the Iowans came to Los Angeles. I don't know, does anybody have relatives in Long Beach or LA? Okay, Long Beach, California is called Iowa by the Sea. And they still have a yearly Iowa reunion, big picnic at the big park out there. And that, because people in Iowa were so taken by this new religion, to the assembly, is a lot of them then migrated out to California because, hey, the weather is better. I mean, I'm a Wisconsinite, so I can say that. And so now we've got this, like, really the fervor of new religion. That's Amy Semple McPherson. And the idea then, too, is how do we keep the people in the seats and the food? You notice it's a commissary. So it started, Azusa did it. Amy Semple McPherson did it. And then a lot of these groups start food pantries, food kitchens. And then they start doing free lunches, free dinners, Sunday after Mass spaghetti dinner, anything, because food is always an attractant. And so if you can get the butts in the seats, you might be able to convert somebody. And so food became a really, almost an evangelistic tool for many religious groups in the United States. And then we have more Germans. In that, also in the early 1900s, affecting the food was this notion of the nature mention, this back to nature as like a backlash to the industrialization of factory life, is to get back to things as we need to eat raw food. And so, again, this is in the early 1900s. Eat raw food, be naked, and take wandering walks for hours. And so this came to the United States, and again, it came to California, of course. And you might notice Paul Bragg cider. The other guy with the gun is Karl May, who is the most published author in any language in the world. And he wrote cowboy books. He was German. He was never to the United States. He was like the inventor of the Winnetou kind of stories. And so all of our modern notions of, like, quote unquote cowboys and Indians are actually because of Karl May, not really about what actually happened. But Karl May, as a German, made this idea of the United States so attractive to everybody that a lot of Germans came over, again, for that idea of freedom. These are some of the more famous nature men, the Nature Boys, Gypsy Boots, Eden Abez, and William Pester. Now, there's a lot of pictures for guys who purported to be hermits living in the, deserts and hills of Palm Springs. But, it was a racket, and like any kind of racket, you start to make money. Gypsy Boots founded one of the first organic health food stores in Los Angeles. Eden Abez was actually a composer. The great Cole Porter song, or not Cole Porter, I'm sorry, Nat King Cole, Nature Boys, that was actually written by Eden Abez. So all of a sudden you have all these people kind of converging with similar ideas. And then World War II happens. And all of the woo stuff, all of the crazy, the spiritualists are there, everybody's there, and we don't have enough time to talk about everybody and their crazy ideas who are out in Los Angeles and out in New York and in the Midwest, exploring different ways to be human and believe in God. Post-World War II, it all starts up again, but with some new elements, because soldiers coming home, both from Asia and from Europe, are now bringing some new ideas with them. And early in the 1920s, Yogananda, who was a practicing, in the Indian tradition of guru, which means kind of teacher, for lack of a better word, was from his religious leader told to go to the United States, that they needed spiritual help. But one thing Yogananda did was, because the idea of like yoga was actually part of a spiritual practice in many Indian Hindu belief systems. And Yogananda separated from the direct spiritual to the practice. And so He was very spiritual and taught the spirituality, but he also taught the physical thing. And that's where, so it comes to the United States and it starts getting separated. Until you get to, by the 60s and Maharishi, and all of a sudden it looks a little stranger now. Because tax laws, religious freedom, lots of different people and influences, you get to really kind of invent it as you go along. I'm sure when I say Maharishi, everybody knows what's in Fairfield. Yes, Fairfield has the Maharishi Institute. Now, they're not a cult. I'm going to, they don't fit the model at all, so I want to be very clear about that. But again, this influence of some of those spiritual leaders that did form cults, like Yogi Bhajan. Yogi Bhajan came over from India specifically saying, hey, I want to be a billionaire. And that's a good racket. So he started with a yoga school. And Kundalini doesn't really mean anything. It's not an official, it's kind of a hybrid put together kind of practice. It's not like a Theravada Buddhism. And so some of these things get, again, that cherry picked. In Los Angeles, he starts building a big following and then starts opening restaurants. And that's the Golden Temple. And I've got one copy. It's my second copy because my first copy I really did hang on to. So that is actually what I found in the page when I got it secondhand. And so, but they start, Yogi Bhajan starts amassing a fortune, and businesses and meeting, that's Pope John Paul II, that's George W. Bush, it's Bill Clinton. Doing the uncomfortable dance is, the recently deceased governor of New Mexico. Thank you. And so, amassing this power, but through food, the restaurants, publishing cookbooks, and then his food businesses. All right, here, I'm going to walk away for just a second. Everybody loves kettle chips, right? They're delicious, and they're owned by a cult. Yogi Tea, same cult. It's Yogi Bhajan. So the influence of the food is, so we're eating this today. Now, Yogi Bhajan died early 2000s, and the religious organization and his family are still fighting over the billions, $14 billion, because the church organization is saying, well, that's our money. And the family's like, it was all a scam, you guys. It's our money. So that's still locked up in the courts. But that shows the influence, again, if someone using both belief and laws and a business acumen to, make some money and make some food. The other ones out in LA, remember, I'm old, I remember seeing Jack LaLanne on Johnny Carson. And then Jim Baker, who was a friend of Jack LaLanne. These guys were also friends with the Nature Boys, our naked Germans. And post-World War II, everybody wants to be healthier. That's Jim Baker 10 years later. Jim Baker, who already owned a restaurant before he followed Yogi Bhajan for a long time, and realized, why am I giving him all my money? I can do this. And so if anybody's heard the Source family, that is what Jim Baker started as Father Yod. They also had a rock and roll band that's pretty good because Sky Saxon was part of it too. So again, in LA, you had these kind of odd convergences of people. Now you may not realize the Source family, but if you watched Annie Hall, you can see the scene I kind of clipped of Woody Allen. There's the scene, they filmed at the Source restaurant in LA, in Hollywood. And, it's where he famously asked for a plate of mashed yeast, which was not on the menu. But it, again, shows these just businesses and using the cover of religion to further their beliefs as well as, their food. I mentioned earlier where it can go off of the rails, of taking illogical logic and following it to a logical conclusion. That is a photo from Jonestown. Jim Jones, when he started, was an apostolic fundamentalist preacher from Indianapolis. He was a socialist. He believed in integrated churches, and the KKK burned him out. in 1955. And that's when he started and took most of his congregation and moved west of San Francisco in Mendocino County, and started food kitchens and started free food programs and started all of these really oddly socialistic things. He was sending people to college to be doctors, to take care of people in the community. But he also kind of got drunk with power and started using drugs and started really wanting more and more power and becoming really paranoid. And that's when, again, one leader with access to all the money, because if you joined the People's Temple, you did, as a cult would, as a commune would, is you gave them all your property, your money, everything, and it went into the central pool. And who was controlling it? Jones. The FBI still has not found what they think about $12 million that they knew Jones had, but they can't put their fingers on it. They still lost to this day. Jones' paranoia and his belief about what the end of the world was going to be just became so all-encompassing, is then we know we had the tragedy at Jonestown. But again, he started as a farm boy from Indiana, and it ended, with thousands of people murdered. That was not a choice those people had. They were murdered. So we have to be careful sometimes when we talk about what is the group and when is it benign, when is it not benign. You wouldn't recognize that. Maybe you would that is a cult that, again, had a very bad end. And they published a cookbook because they believed they needed to purify their bodies before the Space Brothers were coming. And they came with the, comet, the big comet, and that is Heaven's Gate. And so, but before that, they were actively recruiting and, published a cookbook. Sunburst Farms, Norman Paulson, Brotherhood of the Sun. And this is a different example of where over time it just gets a little bit more benign, is nobody was harmed. It was a big commune. They had a great bakery. They were known as like really good, healthy bakers and great cooks. Norman lost his mind a little bit for a long time, about 5 years, took all the group's money, drugs, sex, blew it all. When he finally died, his wife, Patty, who they still own the place, she totally revamped it, and now it's a yoga retreat. It's a wellness retreat. So you can still go out to Sunburst Farms. And so she tamped down their hodgepodge religiosity, which was a combination of like a little kind of fundamentalist Christianity with a little like believing in Space Brothers and Ascended Masters, and a couple of their just kind of odd, very specific to them. Again, this is one of my favorites because he has a ridiculous name, Adi Da. He was not born that. It was Franklin Albert Jones. And then he had a bunch of, he's got some good ones. Baba Free John, Da Love Ananda. I'm not even going to go on. But so I want to talk about him for just a second because, again, this illogical notion of purification of the body is his diet, when we are spiritually pure, finally, we should be able to be living on air alone. He was the progenitor of the breatharianisms. But until you get to that point, there's like one green smoothie. You're supposed to eat this green smoothie once a day. Don't do that because you probably get alkaline poisoning but once a week, okay. And that leaves us a little bit to where things are today. And because that's one of the things that I've been asked is like, are there still the food cults and things around today? And there really are, but they're just a little more subversive. And it depends on like how you're gonna think about it. So Loving Hut is great. If you've been on the West Coast, there's a bunch of them on the West Coast. It's a vegan kind of pan-Asian restaurant. It's really good. The woman who like leads the group is Buddhist, kind of a form of Buddhism, and her big thing is just world peace. You just chant for world peace and go to their restaurants. Now, the reason a lot of these groups had restaurants and food-related businesses is, again, it's a mission. Has anybody worked in a restaurant? All right, or own one? Then if you run a restaurant, one of your biggest cost centers is paying your staff. If your church owns the restaurant, if it's a religious and working at the restaurant is part of your religious mission, you don't have to pay your staff. And that's a pretty successful way to earn some money in the restaurant industry. And that's what the Loving Hut does. So if you go to a Loving Hut, they're pretty gentle. They have just all of their like kind of material on the side by a table. They are not like actively proselytizing, but if you pick up the material and want to talk to them about it, they will talk to you about it. I did that, so. So we're going to come back now with all these notions of like Hinduism and Buddhism and our taste after Jonestown for accepting some of these more outside and really extreme new religious movements really went away. So I grew up, you know, if you grew up in the 70s, you may remember seeing like after school specials warning you that you were going to get kidnapped off the streets by the Hare Krishnas. You know, that, to my knowledge, has never happened. So I did some research that didn't happen. But in this, again, different, Maharishi, different from the Haris, but again, it got smoothed down a little bit. So it's lesser than it would be if you went to a monastery in India and followed a traditional guru, a pathway for belief. When it comes to the United States, again, it gets smoothed down. And so the Maharishi was just that transcendental meditation. And there's modern studies that are done that show that meditation is something that is really good for human beings to do. And as they first started in Fairfield, they've expanded. And so now they're not just teaching meditation, it is a full-blown university where they incorporate meditation into their programs. But if you go over there, go have cafeteria lunch at Maharishi. It's all organic and it's all vegan. And that's part of the belief system, because many Hindu belief systems are about ahimsa, about do no harm, kill no living thing. Now, there are, you know, extremes and a spectrum to all of that, whereas like Jainism is very, very, it's like if you're a Jain monk, that's you're sweeping bugs out of the way before you step. But again, just like everywhere else, everything is on a spectrum. You can, you know, be a member of a group and know that you're only, you know, showing up on the high holidays. It's just, you know, that's people. I like to always end with a little bit, again, I said I'm from Milwaukee, and this is a picture of some of the lovely women at the Sikh temple in Milwaukee. And if you're familiar, again, with that food as the attractant, and you can still go for longer after the service, you get a free lunch. I think they have a donation now. But many of these groups still today, in their belief systems, are, you know, using food in ways to build community as well as then influence what people are eating. I bring up the Sikh temple in my neighborhood because there's also the danger of how we vilify religious belief and how we vilify the people who are different than us in that way. On August 12th, 2012, a gunman opened fire inside the Sikh temple and killed 7 people. He thought they were Muslim. He was a tattooed, you know, proud Nazi. So our stupidity is going to get everyone killed. So I challenge and welcome everybody, especially you know, we're here at the library, learn about food, learn about the religious beliefs, reject the ones that don't seem, you know, attractive to you, and also be a little wary when something sounds too good to be true, or if it sounds a little too nice, you know, the kind of love bombing kind of thing, that is a cult technique. So just always be wary about what you're eating and who you're eating it with. And I'll leave it here. We can take some questions, but this is a joke. This is a fun thing we built. My husband and I helped, he helped do the thing. If you ever wonder, like, you know, you can use food a little bit and other things at your preferences, and like pick your own religion and find it. And again, this is very humorous. Now, does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Well, I was curious about the Seventh-day Adventist nutrition studies, because they had a lot of influence in terms of the Loma Linda Research Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And they put a lot of funding into nutrition studies, and they own like the Blue Zones company now. I was wondering if you looked into that angle, like
Oh, I did.
not just the culture, but the whole scientific.
So, and it's not just to say, I'm a big fan of libraries, so if you're interested, you can check out my book from the library. But I did, go into the SDA and a lot, and talking about the blue zones. And again, this also becomes like I talked about, like groups of people moving to a place together, and a lot of Seventh-day Adventists moved to Loma Linda, California, and then settled there, and then started all of the health research there and the hospital there and Adventist health, and all of that grew up. And again, they follow almost a vegan diet. And so they are considered some of the, the research into like blue zones. It's one of the healthiest groups of people if you're following that vegan diet.
Can you say the microphone? Well, Ellen G. White, the prophetess of SCAs, when I looked at some of her early writings, it was interesting because I saw she was using the language of Galenic humorism that was Christianized in like the Middle Ages. And kind of later on, they sort of use more scientific jargon. But like early on, so I thought that was really fascinating, the history of Christianity and diet in the Middle Ages and how that...
The SDA is that convergence point of like where science is just described in philosophical and religious terms. And if you think about the progress, we only really were able to identify like vitamins in the late 1890s, early 1900s. And so that is when some of the science language gets incorporated into what we're thinking about, well, how we're talking about food. And especially Ellen G. White incorporated that too. So does anybody have any other questions? I see a question behind.
So I know that like Mormonism has a very specific food culture, especially in Utah. Is that something that you've come across in your research or have explored further?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So it's funny about, so Mormon cuisine, if you look at their cookbooks, is very stodgy. Okay, that's an English, meaning kind of like very kind of stick to your bones. And there's a reason for it. Is on the great migrations that those folks did from central New York eventually to Utah, is food scarcity is a thing. And the Mormons, the women were charged to always take care of the food supplies, and they excelled at food preservation. And so if you notice, a lot of Mormon recipes used canned goods. And yes, modern days canned off the supermarket, but that meant home canned goods. And so that's where a lot of the food culture comes from, of high temperature, because it kills off all pathogens just in case, as well as like preserved food. The other thing that we're seeing now, modern times, that is influenced by Mormonism, is, I don't know if you guys have them out here, like the soda parlors, where they do the fancy sodas and the mixes.
They're approaching quickly.
Yeah, that's a Mormon thing that started, is because, again, no caffeine, no stimulants, though the sugar kind of sneaks by there. And so, the equivalent of a coffee house here is the soda parlor in Provo. And that's where like the young people go and hang out, and you can mix flavors and make crazy soda pop flavors. And, and now it's becoming a real business and franchises. If you want to start your own parlor, you sure can. But again, that's the religion influences the food influences the religion, and all of it comes together in strange ways. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I have a question, sort of. If we were in Michigan, would you be doing Kellogg?
I would be talking about Kellogg, but actually I would probably be talking more about the House of David. I mean, is everybody familiar with the House of David? House of David, Benton Harbor, Michigan. They were famous for their food. They again believed themselves to be the lost tribe of Israel. But it was still fundamentalist Christian. And so, but they had served kosher food. And it's right around there was a train directly from Chicago. So it became, their big moneymaker was a resort they built in Benton Harbor, Michigan. And so Chicago Jews would actually go there as a resort because they're like, the food's kosher, it's close by, it's fun. They didn't really care that the folks were like kind of off in the crazy world. We know about the House of David more because they also had a traveling baseball team. And so there's famous pictures because they dressed like they had side locks, long hair and long beards, and would play ball in that full, hair and get up. So that's why, so House of David, they're very fun. Any other questions? I think you had a question?
I was going to ask, do you have anything in your book about Native American
No,
culture?
no.
Their eating patterns?
No, because it was, and there's a reason, and I could talk about food and everybody forever, but I had to narrow things down a little bit. And so this notion of like new religious movements. Now, were a lot of the, especially in the 60s era, some of these communes influenced by perceived Native American culture? Absolutely. When you look at some of those 60s groups, a lot of them, especially in Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California, were just adopting really like pastiche of Native American belief systems and kind of making it their own. And so that was definitely an aspect of the belief system, but it was never much on the food. It didn't affect the food as much, so I kind of left that aside.
Well, the big issue, if Native Americans adhere to their customary diets, they would not have the rate of diabetes that they have.
Sure.
Because they've adopted processed foods.
Well, that's everybody. If none of us ate processed foods, we'd be a lot healthier.
They
Yeah.
have a very high percentage in their population.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a movement to go back to
Right.
like all of us, to go back to more simpler, basic.
Sure. Have you, Sean Sherman up in Minneapolis, Owami, and I'm from Wisconsin. Again, there's a lot of great native like chefs in Wisconsin and Minneapolis. So all of the Lakota people are trying to bring it back, and so you can go to the shops and get Red Lake harvested wild rice, and so people are trying and trying to bring it back to consciousness. Yeah. Any other questions about anything? Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming. Feel free to come up and have a look at a book.